This is the Long Island Retro Gaming Podcast.
Everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Long Island Retro Gaming Podcast. My name is Joel, and with me today is Brendan to talk about the Sharp X68000. The 68000 was a gaming PC that came out only in Japan in, I believe, 1987.
Correct.
And Brendan is very knowledgeable about the system. He has had one for a long time. He has had a complete one for a long time, and he has been kind enough to share it at the Long Island Retro Gaming Expo for the past few years. Another kind of side note, Brendan is also the museum coordinator for the expo, so this guy knows his stuff. So without further ado...
Apparently.
Well, I mean, someone's got it, right? Without further ado, let's talk about this wacky system. Let's start with the intro. What is it, Brendan?
Well, you got a lot of the main details out of the way. I mean, it is first and foremost, it's a computer. It's not a dedicated gaming console, though it was used heavily for games, and that's why it's well known now, especially amongst retro gamers. But it was considered to be kind of the Mercedes-Benz of home computers that you could purchase in Japan back in 1987. I mean, this thing was so much more expensive than the other computers at the time. I believe I read an estimate that in today's money, it was the equivalent of a $5,000 computer in Japan in 1987. So you only had one of these if you were well off, and if you were a gamer, you only had one if your parents had the money to buy the very best. The computer market in Japan is a whole interesting little subculture that you can get into if you're a gamer. There's a lot of different computer platforms. You'll hear about computers such as the PC-88 and the PC-98. You'll hear about the FM Towns, which was probably the most direct competitor to the X68000. You'll hear about the MSX, of course, which is a computer platform, basically a standard platform that was very popular in Japan and had tons of different versions and variants. And you'll hear about the X68000, and the conversation usually goes that the X68000 was the best of them all at the time that it was out, and it was the most expensive, and it had the best graphics and the best sound that you could get, and that's pretty much what it comes down to.
What was the install base like? I have to imagine at that price, I mean, were there a lot of these around?
You know, I don't consider it to be a rare system. It's not like something like the FM Towns Marty or some of these other obscure things that had very low runs. I don't have an exact figure on how many units were made, but in Japan they're not uncommon. Like, you can walk into like an old retro game store or a retro computer store, and you'll probably see one on the shelf if it's a place that sells computers. If it's a regular video game store, maybe not. But a friend of mine who just went to Japan said that they went to a store called Beep. Everybody tells me if I ever go to Japan, I have to go to Beep, because they sell old computers and they almost always have X68000 stuff there, towers and monitors and software and everything in the original box and what have you. So if you're in Japan and you want an X68000, you can go out on the street and find one, right? It's not like the kind of thing where it's so rare that the only way to find one is from another collector or a rare eBay auction or something like that. But in the United States, on the other hand, now you're relying on people that have paid to import the thing. And so you really are never going to just walk into a store anywhere and find one in the United States. I mean, unless you find a store that caters to importing stuff, or has a crazy trade-in from some collector that imported computers from Japan. I mean, who knows? You might get you might have one of those stories. But in terms of being in the States and having this computer never released in the States, which I consider to be a shame, you're just not going to find one without importing it.
When I went to Japan a couple years ago, I saw one in a store, and I think that had been shortly after we first met, and I learned of the 68,000's existence. So obviously I thought of you, because in my mind you're the 68K guy, and it was pretty cool. I've heard you say in the past that this computer was kind of compared to like an exotic car, like at a car show, and there'd be some crazy, I don't know, Lamborghini or something. Everyone's kind of flocking around it. We definitely have seen that at the expo. One thing, the first time I ever saw it, which I believe was in 2016, the one thing that struck me, besides that it was just cool looking, was the sound coming out of the thing. I think you had Castlevania on at the time, and I just blown away by, I don't know if it was the speakers or I'm sure it's a combination of the speakers and the sound chip and everything, but it was incredible.
The audio is mostly the reason why I wanted the thing. I don't know if you could see in the background, I have my shelf of 80s synthesizers behind me. I love old computer music. I love video game music, chip tunes, 80s music, that kind of stuff. And the X68000, the audio capabilities are just, they're not only do they sound good like right out of the box, but there's also things you can add to the computer to enhance the sound. So on a base level, the X68000 has an 8-channel FM synthesizer chip. That sounds complicated. Basically what it is, it's a Sega Genesis sound chip with the ability to play 2 additional instruments. So it's basically a Sega Genesis with a few more sounds. But what you can do is you can add MIDI capability to the X68000 through one of the expansion ports in the back. And what that lets you do is it lets you hook in these MIDI modules, basically external sound cards, that the games had, certain games would have MIDI capabilities, and instead of using the internal sound chip of the X68000, would play the music through these MIDI boxes, these MIDI sound modules, such as the MT32 or the SC55. If you're familiar with PC gaming, some of those modules were compatible with DOS games. And so X68000 had that compatibility, and those MIDI boxes to this day, I think just sound absolutely amazing. Another interesting thing that the X68000 does on certain games, specifically games like Gradius, they'll actually take the internal sound chip from the X68000, combine it with the MIDI sound from one of the MIDI boxes, and actually play both of them simultaneously.
Wow. And
it kind of layers on top of each other. And so whenever I'm showing someone the X68000, I always just put on Gradius and go into the sound test demo mode, because you can flip between the different settings and hear the difference. It's like, here's how it sounds with just the regular sound chip. Here's how it sounds with the MT32 layered onto the internal sound chip, and here's how it sounds with the SC55 box. It supports all 3 versions, so you can very clearly hear the difference. And everybody has the same reaction. They can't believe that it sounds that good from 1987. It's just so crystal clear,
I couldn't
and
believe it.
Lively. Like it just, even with the speaker, I have decent speakers hooked up, but they're not huge, powerful speakers. The audio fidelity of what's coming out of them is just so rich and clear, and people, like, always, without me even prompting them, are just like, oh my God, I can't believe that is coming out of that computer, and that the computer is 30 years old.
Yeah.
Like, how is that possible? but it is, and I can't even imagine being a kid back in the late '80s and early '90s in Japan and having that in your house and hearing it, compared to
A
what you
Famicom
may
or
have
something.
used to been hearing from a Famicom or a Genesis or anything. It still, every time I play it, just blows my mind.
Well, I'm looking at your show notes right here, and I want to go over the hardware a little bit, and then I have tons of questions, and I'm sure you have tons of things you want to talk about as well. So it looks like there were two models released. Is that right?
No, there's a couple different models. In fact, they released from 1987 to 1993. They released different models. I'm going to pull up the Wikipedia page just so I can reference this accurately, because on the Wikipedia for the thing, actually a lot of really good information on that article. They released a new version of the X68000 every year.
Wow.
The most common, I guess, form factor of the X68000 is the dual tower design. It's a vertical tower with two basically separate modules. On one side has the disk drive, the power supply, and optional hard drive. And the other side has the motherboard, which is just a giant PCB and a little auxiliary card for the video. Most interesting about what I find really interesting about the design of the actual tower is that there is actually another circuit board in the base of the X68000. So if you ever see the tower, there's an entire circuit board covering the entire bottom of the X68000, and all of the internal audio. Pretty sure almost all the internal audio capabilities is on that circuit board in the base of the unit. So that kind of acts as an intermediary between the disk drive, the power supply, and the hard drive and the motherboard. And then in between, there's the audio and the power switch circuitry and all the routing to communicate between the drive and the motherboard. It's a really unique, interesting
Layout.
design.
Just for the hardware nerds out there, I'm looking at I guess maybe the first and the last. So just as a comparison to see where they started from and where they went hardware-wise, the 1987 model featured a 10 megahertz Motorola processor, 68,000 CPU to be exact, 1 megabyte of RAM. Those were the days, right? And
Yep.
and no hard drive. And by the end, it was coming with a 25 megahertz CPU, 4 megabytes of RAM, and an optional 80 megabyte SCSI hard drive, which was an enormous amount of space back then.
Back then, yep.
So that's, I mean, those look like significant upgrades. So I guess they really were trying to kind of push the envelope a little bit.
Yeah, like I said, every year they were getting gradually better, usually in terms of how much RAM came standard. So the earliest models had 1 megabyte of RAM, like you said, and that's really not enough to run almost half the games. You need at least two, and then you need at least 2 megabytes of RAMs to run, I would say, probably 80% of the software library, and then that last 20% you need the 4 megabytes, and we're talking games like Street Fighter and Ghouls and Ghosts, some of the later games that came out that were virtually perfect arcade ports and just required the extra RAM to run.
Right. So what constitutes a complete 68,000? I remember seeing your setup, and it had so much stuff. I couldn't even remember seeing joysticks and maybe a flight stick and speakers and keyboard and.
Yeah, that's a great question. Remember, the X68000 is a computer, and so that means you are at the mercy of how many peripherals you want to get for it and how many you need for it, right? So at the very base, obviously you need the tower. You need a keyboard and mouse, which is a whole discussion right there. Yeah, those are the things you need. I actually, now that I think about it, you probably could get away without a mouse, but you should have one. You absolutely need to have a keyboard. If you don't have a keyboard, you can't start or do anything. You need some kind of game controller. And that right there, and of course a video display, which I could probably do a whole podcast on the friggin' video display for the X68000, because there's a lot to know about sync rates and which games will display in the right refresh rate, and what you can do to convert it to VGA and upscalers and an original monitor. There's a lot to discuss on just the video side. But really, I mean, the bare minimum, you need the tower, you need a keyboard, you need a game controller, and you need some kind of display. I'll just call it a display solution, because there are many ways you can get the thing to actually display a picture, right? If you want to go full tilt, get the mouse. You can get the only official controller that Sharp made for the X68000, which is called the Cyberstick, which is a big desktop joystick. It's not a controller that fits in your hand. All of the regular controllers that would be typically used with an X68000 or an MSX at the time were made by Hudson Soft or various other companies. You'd see them making these controllers that were similar to Famicom controllers. They called them Joy Cards, and basically you could just buy a Joy Card that was compatible. And the MSX and X68000 were cross compatible, so they were usually marketed together. But Sharp actually put out their own controller called the Cyberstick, which is the only official Sharp branded controller that came out for the X68000. Otherwise, you just need to get a Joy Card, or you can mod a Genesis controller, anything that has the little Atari 9-pin port. Yeah, you can mod those to work, or you can find an MSX Joy Card that will work too. Anyway, not to get too off topic, so the next thing you can do is add in some sort of hard drive or a hard drive modification to use an SD card or a CF card to load ROMs, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And then there's the whole MIDI setup, which is you're going to need the MIDI boxes, the MT32, the SC55, all the cabling. You need a MIDI expansion port that goes in, expansion card that goes inside the X68000 and connects to the MIDI boxes. And on top of that, you need a mixer. You need some sort of audio mixer to mix, because you're dealing with multiple audio signals. Right. You need a mixer to put those all together. And then, of course, you need your speakers. So the X68000 does have a little internal speaker in it, so you actually don't need speakers at a bare minimum. You'll be able to hear internal music and everything from the internal speaker. It just kind of sounds really tinny.
You'd be doing it a huge disservice.
Garbage. Yeah, you're missing out on a huge piece. But obviously, if you have a good set of speakers, you can plug those directly into the X68000. If you're not doing any of the MIDI stuff, you can just plug directly into your audio out and have some nice speakers and use the internal chip. So, and I mean, there's other things too. Like I said, it was a computer. I mean, if there were scanners and network adapters and all sorts of things that, printers and things that you could attach to it. But for gaming, that's probably the most complete setup that you would need. Oh, and additional RAM. You can buy additional RAM expansion cards to go in. So if you have a 2 megabyte system and you want it to be 4 megabytes, you get an expansion card of 2 megs of RAM and put it in there, and you're good.
That's nice. So you're not locked out if you have an earlier model.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sounds like a project.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot. I mean, when I got my tower in 2015, and I know I mentioned earlier that you'll never find one in the States. I actually did find my tower, just my tower. I found it from a guy in California that was selling 2 of them.
Wow.
And I bought the nicer one that he had because I just happened to good timing. I had the money, and I was so naive about this thing. I was like, oh, it's a computer. I'll just plug in a keyboard and I'll just hook it up to a monitor and I'll play some games. It'll be cool. I'll have an X68000. And it's not until after you get the thing that you realize that almost everything on the system is proprietary. You need to have an X68000 keyboard. You need to have an X68000 mouse. A regular mouse and keyboard won't work. Though, of course, now there are adapters that will make them work. But at the time, even as early as 2015, they weren't available or they were expensive. So it really quickly became, oh my God, I need to buy a lot of other things to get this to do what I want. And it became a hobby within a hobby where I'm like, I need to figure this out. Like I need to get this wired up right. I need to get this to be as complete as it can be and get it to play as much as it can play and get it to sound as good as it can sound. And I started selling some of my other toys to fund it. It's like, all right, I need another $100 to buy the MIDI card. I need a $150 to buy this hard drive mod. I need So it was like, okay, what do I don't really play with anymore? Let me get rid of that and fund the X68000 dream. And it took me 6 months to get everything that in my setup. I haven't added anything after that. I got the tower, I think, in April or May of 2015, and by November, December, it was like done. Like I had everything.
Nice.
So it was a long game. I mean, you're when you import stuff from Japan and you use Japanese auction sites and proxy bidding sites to bid on things that are never going to show up on eBay. You're waiting. You're just sitting around twiddling your thumbs waiting. You're waiting for your bid to be processed and for the auction house to get the thing that you bought, and then they have to then they're shipping it to you from Japan, which can take forever, and you're crossing your fingers that this fragile piece of electronic thing that you shipped across the globe is going to get to you safely. And by the grace of the retro gaming gods, nothing that I ordered came damaged, including the original X68000 monitor, the glass CRT.
Oof.
I actually shipped one of those from Japan and wrote some very specific directions to the auction house to put like extra padding, whatever they needed to do so the glass didn't shatter.
Right.
And I was so nervous, but it got to me, and it is perfect.
Yeah, it's a nice looking monitor.
Not a scratch on it.
So we are going to get to the games for anyone who's a little antsy to get there, but it's coming, I promise. Next, I want to ask about the operating system. I always assumed that it just had one, but looking at your notes here, it looks like that there were three, at least. Human 68K, which was the DOS-like one, SX Windows, which was a GUI, and LHES, which is a simple file system. Were they based on model years? What are the main differences between them? Is one better than the other?
I don't know too much about the operating systems because I really only use LHES. My system is running off of a hard drive modification that basically loads off of a little CF card. And in the X68000 community, there's these things called disk images, which is basically a plug and play set of software that basically has an operating system. It has ROMs for games and various other software, and you flash the disk image to the CF card, and if everything is configured properly, it runs. And the disk image uses LHES, which is just a very simple up and down file navigator where you can go through your folders and load games from that, load software from that. And I never really played around with SX Windows, which is kind of like a Windows-like X68000 operating system. I haven't really used it. And Human 68K is just a black screen, DOS prompt. Very similar commands to DOS, and occasionally I have had to use that just to get into certain utilities to configure the X68000. You have to manually tell the X68000 how much RAM is in the computer. It cannot detect it. It doesn't have the ability to detect how much RAM there is. You have to tell it. If you install 4 megabytes of RAM, you then have to go into the software and tell the system that there's 4 megabytes of RAM because it doesn't even know to look for it. So you use Human 68K to get into some of those utilities, but usually you set those things, and if you're using the disk image, then you can set it and forget it.
Right. All right, let's get to the good stuff. Let's get to the games. The first question I have is, where is the magic with the system? Is the magic in the actual games themselves, or is the magic in the system where like you have a port like Castlevania that just sounds amazing, or is it both?
So with the games, the X68000 is known mainly because of the perfect arcade ports that exist. And when we say perfect, I mean we're meaning like perfect. Um, the X68000 was the development system for the CPS Capcom games, like Street Fighter 2 or maybe the CPS 2 games. I'm drawing a blank. But Capcom used this computer to develop games like Ghouls and Ghosts and Street Fighter, and like so this was not only was a home computer, but it was being used professionally by game developers because it had the same hardware, it had the same sound chip, it had the same video capabilities. And so what you end up with is when you play these games on the X68000, you are playing arcade perfect ports because you're playing it on the same hardware, and or extremely similar hardware. So that's what it became known for. And where's the magic? Obviously there are some original games for the X68000. The Castlevania game at the time it was created was exclusive to the X68000 before it was then ported to PS1. But I don't know. I think it's a combination of everything. I mean, it was marketed as a multimedia workstation as well as a gaming station. I mean, it is capable of the most incredible graphics and sound that was available at the time. So, and the video games made use of that. It's funny. I'm also a big fan of the Amiga computer, and the Amiga was marketed almost identical to how the X68000 was marketed. It just, was 1/10 the price and, definitely not as powerful, but by the same token, pretty good in its own right for how much it cost. But if you were in Japan and you could pay the premium, you got the very best, and that's what the games showcase. I mean, you're seeing the best possible quality that you could have seen in 1987.
I mean, I have to say, I'm looking at the Wikipedia list of the games, and there is almost 800 releases on here. So, if you had one of these computers back in the day, you certainly had your pick of things to play. Holy moly! I'm just looking at the categories. I see like visual novel, run and gun.
There's a lot of visual novels. There's a lot of point and click RPG type games.
I see business simulation game. I wonder what that
yeah,
is.
There's a lot. There's a lot of stuff. I mean, and the X68000 community has kind of whittled down like the safe for English speaking games. So games that don't have translations. Or there's a lot of X68000 games that are in English. Like the menu is in English. They haven't been fan translated. The menu's in English. And there's plenty that aren't. It's sort of luck of the draw. So occasionally you either gotta do some Google Translate, or if you have a friend that can speak Japanese or read Japanese, have them over and help you figure out, or just click around until you get the game to start the way that you want it to start. But there's a lot of, I would say, I think a majority of the stuff is in English, and a lot of the games don't require you reading unless you're playing the visual novels.
Right. That was one of my other questions. Do you know if there's a lot of fan translation going on with these games?
There's not a lot, but there is some. There's a game called Star Cruiser, which I'm actually kind of interested in playing. It's believe it or not, it's a first-person 3D game, and it's completely in Japanese. The menu's in Japanese. All the text is in Japanese. It seems like an interesting game, and I was like, well, I guess I can't play that because, nope, too much text. And then I think it was a couple months ago, I saw a video. Some guy is working. He has a beta version, and he's in his spare time is just translating it. So I mean, there's people doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a much smaller community. I mean, if you do a fan translation for a like a Super Famicom RPG, all the JRPG fans are going to basically worship you and sing your praises, and there's a large audience for people that have access to Super Nintendo emulators or EverDrives or what have you. There's not as many people that have access to the X68000 stuff. And there's a lot of people that still don't even know it exists, or that. And there are emulators for the X68000, but again, even those take some configurations to set up. So it's not a user-friendly system. It's not something that you can just jump into quickly and play some games. I'm sure there's some good emulation solutions out there, but that's really the only way that a lot of people can play the games, and that's why on the fan translation side there's not as much activity.
That was another one of my questions, is if somebody was just starting out and say they just wanted to play some of the games, check out what everything was about, do you have any recommendations for, are there any, is there a best to use emulator if they probably understandably don't have the resources to get a full working setup?
Yeah, I got to be honest, I never used an emulator.
I guess you don't need to. So.
I dove into the real thing, and throughout the course of owning the real thing, I never had a need to use an emulator for any sort of testing or anything like that. I think there's 2 emulators out there. I forget the names. XM6, isn't XM6 one of them? Hold on, let me Google it real quick.
And we'll get those into the show notes, so if anyone is interested, we'll have links, or at the very least the names of the emulator, so you can check it out.
Yeah, XM6 Pro 68K is one, and I believe there's another one, maybe, I think it has Windows in the name, WinX 68K. That might be it too. So I don't know how easy they are to configure. They might be super easy. They might be like any other emulator. But I haven't used them. That being said, I would highly recommend that people check them out. A lot of people that see the X68000 that are serious collectors, get excited and want to own one. And I don't discourage them from trying to get one, but I do tell them that they're in for a long haul.
Yeah, it's a thing.
And if the emulator will satisfy the craving, I tell them emulate it first, play some games, mess around with it, get the fix, right? Dive into it, play with some of the software, have fun, and see if it satisfies your craving to get into the X68000 and explore the games and whatnot. And if you got to have the hardware, you got to have the hardware. I mean, I go for it. Try to get one, but it's expensive. You got to be patient. But you can do it. And there's lots of guys that have awesome setups, and there's a good community behind the X68000, and if you can pull it off, it's awesome. I mean, it's fun. It's a great hobby within a hobby. But
you've had this thing out at the Long Island Retro Gaming Expo for the past few years. You've seen a lot of reactions. You've put out a lot of games. What are the most popular games that kind of tickle the public, and what are the reactions like when people learn and see this thing for the first time?
Without question, Castlevania. Whenever I bring it to the expo, everybody wants to play Castlevania. That seems to be the one game that people know about being on the X68000. They've heard of it. They know that there was a port for an exclusive Japanese computer. They might not even know the name of the computer. They just know that. Sometimes they'll be like, "Oh, is this the thing that has that Castlevania game that never came out in America? Is this it?" Granted, there's more than one Castlevania game that didn't come out in America,
right.
But like that, that's been said. It's like, "Oh, is this the computer that has that Castlevania game?" And so, more times than not, that's always like a go-to game. A lot of requests for Final Fight. So there's so many versions and ports of Final Fight out there. The X68000 is one of the best. So that one's always requested. Ghouls and Ghosts. A lot of the Capcom arcade stuff is popular. Ghouls and Ghosts, by the way, if you can play it with the MIDI setting on, I mean, you'll never ever want to play that game on another system ever again. You play Ghouls and Ghosts on the X68000 with the MIDI on it. It is like just by far the greatest way to play that game. There's no other way. There's no other version that compares. I mean, it's perfect. It sounds amazing. It looks amazing. Disturbingly hard, but just enjoyable because of just the audio-visual experience.
Well, I mean, that game, no matter where you run into it, you're normally not having the easiest time.
Nope.
You touched on the community before. So obviously the community is small because there aren't a ton of these around, and especially here in North America. What is the community like? Are they friendly? Are there?
Yeah, they're awesome. They're amazing. Probably the best retro gaming community that I've encountered.
It's a high endorsement.
The nicest, most helpful people. Because it is a small group, and they understand.
Right.
It's a challenge to get the thing configured properly, to get all the parts. They know it's expensive. Resources are limited when it comes to information about certain things and certain repairs. And it's great. I mean, the interactions I've had with people there's a Facebook group, there's a great forum called NFG Games, which has an X68000 subforum, and just the people that are putting together, like I mentioned earlier, the disk images, solutions for people that want to get set up and get rolling and play games, and have the ROMs configured properly and that kind of stuff. And also there's associated with the NFG Games forum, there's a really good wiki for X68000 knowledge. There's a good knowledge base of repairs and differences between models, differences between monitors, everything you'd want to know about the video sync issues. I don't think I would have been able to figure it out had it not been for that forum and that wiki. I mean, there's a wealth of information there, and we're talking like razor specific things that you'd be sifting through manuals, and I don't even know if you'd be able to find the information you needed. And of course, the manuals being all written in Japanese,
right.
You're even at more of a disadvantage. But no, I mean, you can throw up a question and expect some pretty detailed responses. Yeah, I mean, I even had one guy, I went to go redo the caps on my X68000, and at the time I did not own a desoldering gun, and I was planning on buying one, but I think the expo may have been coming up, and I wanted to get it done in time for the expo, so this guy actually just shipped me his desoldering gun and a whole bag of caps to do it. He just sent it to me for free. I think I just paid him for the shipping. He just shipped me his whole gun and all the caps, and he helped me through it, and I did it, and I shipped the soldering gun back to him. And we're talking like that's a $300 tool that he lent me.
Yeah.
And so that's just an example of like, this isn't even someone that I met at the expo or even on Long Island, and he just shipped it to me because he knew I was an X68000 guy and helped me through it. I got it done, no problems, and that's just an example of how awesome the community is. I mean, it's the best.
That's fantastic. That I was going to ask you where should people go if they want to learn more, but you just listed everything, so we will have those in the show notes. So I kind of have my closing questions for you are kind of twofold. How do you feel about the journey that this thing has led you on? Because it really does sound like a journey, and you're still journeying with it. And would you do it again?
So it's weird to think that like another game system would, kind of open doors for you, right? I don't feel that way about any of my game consoles or any of the other computers I have or any of the things that I have. The X68000 creates this like this attention grabbing curiosity that it just warrants conversation. So it sparked so many conversations in my circle of retro game friends, and really is what led me to becoming a bigger part of the Retro Gaming Expo. I think the second year I was invited to do a panel on just the X68000, and I wasn't really, on staff at that point, but I did the panel and brought the machine and set it up for everybody to play, and it was, huge hit, and we spoke to so many people that we're standing in a convention full of video games, and you have a crowd around this one thing, and people that have seen it all come over and see this for the first time, and those are conversations that I never would have had. Being able to speak to people that I probably wouldn't have met and get involved in the expo in a way that I didn't expect to get in, and it's really due to this machine, this setup that I pieced together, and for me, I mean, it's just I 363 days out of the year it's in my house, and it's great, and I like playing it, and I do play it a lot, but it's great for the expo to share it, and show it to people. I think most of the joy of having the X68000 is letting people try it for the first time, letting people play it, to see that reaction when they've, like I said, they've seen so many things in the retro gaming world, but they've never gotten their hands on this thing, and to get them to give them that experience, either for the first time or people that come to the expo every year and see it and ask about it, like, hey, is it coming back? Is it coming back? Or are you the guy? Are you the guy that brings the X68000? Like, I mean, it's weird that a game system would create that sort of, I guess, positivity and that journey in my life, but it has. I mean, there's no other game system in my life that's created that sort of impact on my life. I mean, it's so weird and nerdy to say, but it really has.
I mean, not to turn this into, an expo show too much or anything, but if you think about it, that's kind of where the expo came from in a much more broader sense. It's getting together and like appreciating and showing people some things they've never seen, and kind of sharing in the awesomeness that is the reason why everyone is into this hobby. So it is really cool though that's this specific obscure amazing system has done that for your life. And I mean, I guess from your answer I can guess the answer to the question, would you do it again? It has to be absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad I got into it when I did, because the parts and things have gotten more expensive. They were expensive in 2015, and they are more expensive now. So I'm glad I got in before it kept going up and up, to collect all the parts. But again, if it's something that really interests you, check out the emulators. And then, don't be in a rush. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And, piece it together. I mean, it's fun. It's fulfilling when you get it all together and it works. And your gamer friends are they'll be over. Every time my friends come over, I mean, you got to get some X68000 time in.
Well, yeah, you know what they say about Brendan's house. It's come for the 68,000, stay for the pinball machines.
Yep. Well, we could have a pinball podcast next. Yes. Do another hour on that by itself.
I am down, because I actually don't. I could know a lot more about pinball, so we'll be talking about that.
Oh, there's so much. There's so much. Pinball's a whole
I know, it's a
world.
whole other thing.
It's a whole world.
So for anyone who wants to learn more about the 68,000, we're going to have some different show notes in both the podcast and the YouTube video. We are gonna, in the YouTube video, you will, if you're watching this there, you will have already seen pictures of the different peripherals and anything else we can get our hands on to show you. Brendan, I really would like to thank you for coming on, talking about this, teaching me more about it, because I think it's an amazing system, and I'm sure all the listeners thank you too.
All right, Joel, thanks for having me.
No problem. And we'll catch you next time, guys. Take care.
And now, here are a few music samples from the X68000. Enjoy!